Welcome, my book-loving coaching friends. Today, I want to talk about Etica y Coaching Ontologico by Rafael Echeverria. My name is Kirsten Dierolf, and I love creating these book reviews where I read coaching books, tell you what's in it, and then evaluate the books according to my 3 criteria: readability, academic rigor, and usability. Let me first introduce our author. Rafael Echeverria was born in Santiago in Chile, and he is a sociologist and also a doctor of philosophy. He has published widely, sadly for us English speakers, mostly in Spanish. And he is an expert in the thought of Nietzsche, and his first work, Ontologia del Lenguaje, Ontology of Language, was published in 1994 and was widely recognized. He is the current president and founding partner of the international company Newfield Consulting, and he has served as a professor at many universities, also visiting scholar at Stanford University. The book that I'm going to be talking about today is Etica y Coaching Ontologico. The translation would be Ontological Ethics and Coaching. It is a really fascinating book, and it was already published in 2011, so it is pretty old. But I think since it has not really gained traction, at least in my mind, in the English-speaking world, and since it really espouses a very interesting philosophy, I want to introduce this book for you. The book is structured into 42 chapters, and these 42 chapters form a coherent argument. So you can't jump between chapters because you will not understand, because every chapter is based on the previous chapter. Echeverria positions the book as a response on the crisis facing humanity today, which in his view is expressed on 3 levels. One is the increasing difficulty of sustaining the meaning of life as a condition of survival. The second is the increasing difficulty in preserving and developing relevant personal relationships. And the third one is finding difficulties in consolidating harmonious forms of coexistence. And I think even if the book was written in 2011, I would see 3 difficulties having even been exacerbated today. So I would think that a crisis of meaning, a crisis of relationship, and now more than in 2011, a crisis of personal relationships and the replacement of personal relationships by parasocial relationships through social media has become really prevalent. And then we see that the world has become even more divided since 2011. So I think it is very much timely book, even though it is 14 years old at this point. The threefold crisis in the ethical field for Echeverria translates into 2 major effects. One is that there is a lot of unnecessary suffering, and the second one is the loss of awareness in the immense transformative potential that human beings possess. For Echeverria, this raises the question of being human, as he labels his 3rd chapter. In the following chapter, he walks us through a history of philosophy as it pertains to how we understand human beings. And I find it one of the most concise and useful summaries of the different strands of philosophy and how they pertain to coaching, how they pertain to what we are doing in coaching, how do they pertain to how we conceptualize a human being. In chapter 3, he also translates the term ontological for us. As philosophers or people with a philosophical education would probably think, what is he doing with ontology here? He is using ontology in the sense of Heidegger and phenomenon. According to Heidegger, as referenced by Echeverria, the term ontology is very different from the classical tradition. Classically, ontology was the theory of being as being and subcategory of metaphysics. It is about being as such, about the reality. In contrast to this, in Heidegger's thinking, philosophical reflection always has the human being as a starting point. Understanding the human phenomenon constitutes a kind of paradigm for all our other paradigms. Echeverria says, and I quote on page 16, my translation, "The practice of ontological coaching is tributary to and dependent on the interpretation of the human being contained in the ontology of language." Now, of course, this sounds very complicated, but please bear with me. It will become clearer in the following chapters. Ontological ethics and coaching goes back to Socrates to explain this difference. In Socrates' times, there were two different philosophical schools, one of Parmenides and the other of Heraclitus. Parmenides said that everything that exists refers to the category of being. So it is immutable and unique. And Heraclitus had the opposite view, namely that everything changes. You might have heard the sentence pantare, or everything flows, and the statement that you can never step into the same river twice because it won't be the same river and it won't be the same person stepping into the river. Socrates opted for Parmenides, and this strand of philosophy became very strong in Western philosophy and moved into, I think, developed into dominant paradigm today. Maybe you can say it like that. Echeverria asks us to take Heraclitus more seriously and assume that change is at the core of what is. And I really like this perspective because it is very much one of the tenets of solution-focused coaching as well, which is that change happens all the time. And it also connects with Steve DeShaze's work and Bateson's work. And overall, I have found many interesting parallels between what Echeverria writes and what we are saying in Solution Focus. Another notion that Echeverria takes from Nietzsche is rejecting the idea that a human being can be reduced to one unit, but he positions human beings as a structured multiplicity, which are always integrating oppositions, which are in permanent contention among themselves. This is something that we would not say in Solution Focus as a minute but very interesting difference to me, because in Solution Focus we would say when we're talking about a person, we're talking about something that is indivisible, that is, we can say about what a person does and what a person thinks, but there isn't such a thing as parts of a person. But that will become more apparent what Echeverria does with that in the following chapters of this book. Echeverria is also positioning 5 basic premises of the metaphysical program of Parmenides, and this is done in chapter 5, pages 20 and 21. And I'm not quoting directly, but the essential 5 basic premises that he then ends up critiquing are: A, that everything is immutable and change is an illusion. B, that the category of being is transcendent, so it's metaphysics. It is not directly perceivable through the senses. C, that truth is when you access and understand the being of things. So there is meaning, being, essence, whatever you want, beyond the senses, and humans have to understand it. And how humans do that is by reason. So reason is then said to be the one thing that separates human beings and animals. And that is also a point which says that there is a radical discontinuity between animals and human beings. This traditional metaphysical program, which basically states that human beings should use reason in order to understand the true nature of things, which is beyond the reach of their senses, then was criticized in modernity. Echeverria draws a very interesting line through philosophy in the subsequent chapters. He starts with, I would say, Spinoza, then Feuerbach, Darwin, and Nietzsche, also mentioning in passing the German romantics like Schlegel, Herder, and Fichte. Moving on to Nietzsche, obviously, Echeverria is a Nietzsche scholar. Martin Buber, Heidegger, and the Philosophy of Language by Austin and Searle. From Buber, he takes the dialogic nature of human beings. It is this idea that conversations constitute human beings. From Austin, he takes the idea that language is not only a means of communication, but also performs certain functions. For example, if you sign a peace treaty, suddenly the world changes. If you say I do in a wedding, your words are doing something. They're not only discovered through reason, but language is now seen as capable of generating new realities. Another interesting thought that Echeverria is taking from the biological science, especially neuroscience, is the idea of neuroplasticity. So that by our actions and by our language, human beings change the realities of their brains. Each experience transforms us, and therefore, the idea of the immutable truth of being that reason needs to discover becomes more and more unpractical. He ends this line of thought by introducing his Ozar model. And it is a graph that obviously I cannot present here in the podcast, but if you Google it, you can probably find it. Those of you who know Heinz von Förster or Bateson might be already familiar with the idea of second order observation. And this is also included in Echeverria's Ozar model. And he states that it was influenced by American philosophical pragmatism. He draws a kind of feedback loop. So a person acts, and as long as they're happy with the results of their action, there is nothing necessary. Change is not necessary. However, if the actions do not result in what the person wanted, then, so if the actions result in quote unquote feedback that you don't like, feedback of reality of other people, whatever, then you have to change your actions. In order to effect this change, Echeverria says it is necessary to find out why we acted the way we acted. So the question that he states on page 29 is what conditioned our action? And this is his idea that in order to change your action, you have to understand why you acted in a certain way. This is not something we would say in solution focus because we don't really care about motivations or why something exists. We're more interested in what somebody wants and how they're going to get there. But again, it is really interesting because the way Echeverria positions this is if you then reflect on, I would say, your motivations. You are introducing this idea of second order observation. So you're not only observing the result of your actions that you don't like, but you also observe yourself while you are engaging in these actions. And that is very similar to systemic concepts that we also see today in other coaching approaches. Echeverria sees Parmenides' metaphysical program, or the remnants of it, coming into play here, especially when people are stuck and then come to coaching. If they have this idea of themselves as immutable, so I am shy, therefore I cannot. Or if they see others or reality as immutable, as not able to change, then they get stuck because they cannot get the results that they want from their actions. And for him, this actually is one of the most important triggers for coaching. He states on page 33, the observer points to how we make sense of the situation we face, how we interpret what happens. In other words, the way we formulate the problem. The possibilities of action we perceive depend on the type of observer we are. As we change the way we observe, new forms of action emerge. We're all different observers, and therefore we bring different horizons of possibilities for dealing with the same situation. But we can change the observer. We can change the observer that we are, and thus become a more powerful observer, capable of perceiving possibilities for actions that we did not see before. I find this really fascinating. What solution focus does, and what Mark McCurgo wrote in his book, The Second Generation of Solution Focused Practice, refers to Gibson and his theory of affordances, in principle saying the same thing. By having a conversation with a coach, the client, starts perceiving possibilities that were previously locked to that person, because through the coaching, they see themselves in a different light. They see, and therefore more possibilities open up for them. What I love about this book is that Echeverria doesn't only state that change is necessary for the client, but he also states that change can also be affected in the environment of the client. So transforming social systems and not positioning the responsibility for change solely with the client is also something that is very important in systemic and solution-focused practice, that we are seeing the whole situation, the client and their environment and their emotions and their thoughts. And it seems to me like Etica y coaching ontologico is positioning the same thing. Now, if you take this seriously, that through your perspective and through changes in your perspective, you can change your reality. It also means that there cannot be, I mean, it's a bit of a circular argument, but there cannot be one reality that you can discover through reason. There need to be different realities depending on the perspective that you're taking. So in a sense, this old social constructionist sentence of there is no view from nowhere. So everybody has their own perspective. And Echeverria uses this springboard to state that we need to call into question the idea of truth that metaphysics propose to us and adopt a different concept of truth. Every reality is perceived by an observer. Now, of course, when you are looking at ethics, the ugly criticism of relativism rears its head, obviously. Echeverria states that not all interpretations are equal. However, instead of privileging those perspectives that are quote unquote true and equivalent to truth that can be discovered by the one and only reason, which also then states that, things can be right or things can be wrong because they have a stronger or a weaker equivalence to how things really are, but it becomes the interpretation that opens more possibility and more meaning, more collaboration, more positive results for other people.
Letting go of the idea that we need to use reason to correctly understand reality also opens the field to be more interested in the perspectives of others, rather than calling them heretics or crazy when they have different views of what is happening. We can use their views to extend our perspectives. Echeverria talks about the ethics associated with the notion of system in his chapter 15. He talks about two notions. One notion is that we are actually much more the result of social systems rather than an individual, and the other is that we also can be more aware of how we affect the systems that constitute us. He says, and I quote with my translation, the notion of system reinforces this disposition to greater lightness. It shows us that we're less I and more system than we normally assume, less autonomous subject and more product and predicate than we often think. This allows us to take ourselves with greater innocence and with less guilt, with greater acceptance of what happens to us, and therefore with less suffering. And this is a quote from page 36. Echeverria calls this die Psychologie with Nietzsche. And I really like this idea of becoming a little bit more humble around who we are and what we can do, and becoming a little bit more aware about what forms us, what informs us, and what are we in turn doing to create a positive influence on our environment. It becomes less of a hero and I and more of a we together and our co-creation of our joint realities. And this, again, is very much similar to what we're doing in social constructionism and solution focus. Sividia goes on to say that this is one response to the two great challenges that he mentioned previously. Giving meaning to our lives is related to the challenge of transforming ourselves and transforming the world which we inhabit. Rather than relying on the grand narratives of the past, we, according to Echeverria, quoting Nietzsche, need to start to act in order to generate meaning for our life. The program of ontological coaching is to provide help so that the people who are lost in their quest for meanings can achieve it by way of action. Echeverria also talks about spirituality and is speculating a little bit on what the spirituality of the future may be. What I find completely fascinating is his chapter on the notion of the human soul. Rather than seeing soul as one of the parts of the dichotomy of soul and matter, or mind and matter, he refers to the human soul very, very different. He says that the soul is the particular form of being that characterizes a human being. Within the double relationship of the human being to themselves and also to their environment. Our acting and reacting gives rise the particular type of being that we are, and this is what Echeverria would call the soul. I think this is a very curious and interesting way to make very old concept like soul useful for today's world without having to resort to any body-mind dualism. And for me, it's really charming. When we understand the soul as what makes every individual particular within their surroundings, within their own experiences, in who they became through who they interacted with and the interpretations that they made about themselves, the conclusions that they are taking about what they want to do with their lives and who they are. I think it's really interesting to look at it from the perspective of what coaching is doing. Simon Western has a book out where he is looking at the different discourses around coaching. And one of the discourses that he mentions is the one of a soul guide. And I would see that in practice here. So the coach is someone who helps people move from stuckness when their quote unquote soul, when the way that they are being at the moment doesn't serve them any longer, to transform that into something that is more, or not something, someone who is not stuck and who has more options available to them, and who basically changes their existence. And Echeverria states that it is very important to be humble and careful and very much allow our clients to design and decide who they would like to become. And when people move from being stuck and from having one definition of their identity that is, for example, keeping them stuck, they are transforming themselves into another person for whom other things are possible. They are changing the way they view things. They're changing the way they do things. When we change our perspectives, other things become possible for us. And Mark McCurgo does this via the philosophy of Gibson, and Echeverria does this via the philosophies of Nietzsche, the German romanticists, and Martin Buber, but they end up in a similar space. So coaching is about the transformation of the soul, in parenthesis, which is the particular form of being of a human, not something esoteric. And that transformation enables people to see more possibilities in their lives than previously. Echeverria calls this a phase transition in accordance with systemic theory. In the next part of the book, Echeverria talks about the 6 ethical emotional axes of the ontology of language. This is a chapter that I find, maybe I don't understand it enough, but I don't find it so useful. It's, I would say, for me, it's a little bit confusing. And he introduces the concepts arrogance, resignation, invalidation, fear, low self-esteem, and resentment over against peace, humility, ambition, respect, trust, and dignity. I'm not quite sure how he uses these concepts, and it didn't really become clear to me in the book, but it just maybe due to my limited understanding. I really like his description of the nature of ontological coaching practice. He defines it as a learning practice. And I think it is a really good way of seeing coaching. Coaching is an assistance to learn something, to become someone else, to learn different skills, to move and develop. And chapter 24, the nature of ontological coaching practice, is a really clear chapter. Echeverria states that it is really important to note that the client is not ill. Of course, we know that we are only coaching people not experiencing mental health problems. He states, and I quote, ontological coaching is strictly a learning practice that has a particular feature. It's open to the possibility of a profound transformation that is experienced by the coachee and often recognized by others as a significant change in the type of being he or she was previously. It is in this sense that we identify it as transformational learning. And this is on page 63. Echeverria goes on to talk about the human soul, the person and shadow, and borrowing, I think, a concept from Nietzsche and Carl Gustav Jung. I'm not so sure that it is necessary to assume shadow and not shadow, but yeah, I don't know. The dichotomy here for me is a little bit unclear. Echeverria describes the coaching process, and he says that every coaching starts by the recognition of a problem, and I would say probably it's a recognition of a problem or a development opportunity. And if the client doesn't have a topic, or if the client doesn't have anything that they want to get better at, obviously coaching doesn't make sense. This recognition of a development opportunity places the coachee in what Echeverria calls a transitional space between a past way of being and the possibility of being in a different way in the future. And it's the coach's responsibility to collaborate with the client in this transition. The coach helps the client to reestablish their capacity to flow, to move, to be unstuck. What I find really interesting here is Echeverria says that as human beings, we are living in all times. We're living in the past, we're living in the present, and we're living in the future. So from our past, we're drawing conclusions about our identity. In our future, we're desiring to be someone different, and in the present, we are now. And coaching can work with all of these 3 times, finding a very interesting way of phrasing it. Echeverria also stresses and puts a high importance on the fact that as coaches, we're not interpreting. And that is also something that I find very close to a solution-focused or a social constructionist view of the world. We can only offer an observation, but since there is no single truth, we can share our perspective as coaches, but without attachment to that being the correct way of seeing things. He goes on again to quote Nietzsche and go back to this concept of shadow and human being. Here, I would probably disagree, because Echeverria says As long as we do not understand the root of the problem, we will not be in a position to correct it. I don't think it is necessary to recognize a shadow or to actually even go into a shadow. In our practice, it is useful to figure out who the person wants to become in the future and what are the stories that they can tell themselves to become the person that they want to become. There is no need to look at any shadow negative side or root cause analysis. So I think here we are seeing a clear difference between approaches. Anyway, still very interesting. Echeverria also states that the coach's view is, he calls it a moral view. But what he means by that is that we will support, or the ontological coach will support the client in their own frame of reference, in their own morality. And therefore, the coach needs to detach themselves from their own morality. I would say it's a very interesting phenomenon to look at what happens when you are coaching someone whose morality you cannot support, and when you're noticing that you cannot detach from your own morality. My advice would usually be to do not coach this person because it's not going to work out. But it's very interesting to see that Echeverria also sees this as an issue and requires of the coach to detach from their own morality. Echeverria literally states that he also sees the position of the coach as decentered and influential. Another surprising parallel to narrative and solution-focused coaching stresses that in order for the client to feel safe enough to start a process of transitioning from an old way of being to a new way of being, it is vital that there is a safe space created by the coach. And Echeverria says, I quote again my translation, no matter what the starting point, when the client opens up to their coach and confides their wounds, pains, and suffering, the coach must be able to close that path and put himself in that person's place to understand them and therefore to love them. And I also like how he says that love is built in interaction. So the relationship is not built as an abstract thing, but the relationship is built by the actions of the coach, which are listening, detaching from them, from the coach detaching from themselves, genuinely putting ourselves in the client's shoes in a way of understanding that given how this person became who they became, it is only natural that they're feeling the way that they're currently feeling. Echeverria also states that trust is earned by the coach. So the interactions between coach and clients create the necessary space. And Echeverria stresses that humility and centering the client is of utmost importance. In the later part of the book, Echeverria also becomes a little bit self-critical and critical of some forms of ontological coaching. I don't want to go too much into that, but what he stresses, and something I can support, is that it is very important for the coach to stay humble and not privilege their own view of things over the client's view of things. And another thing that I find very useful is that Echeverria, between teaching coaching and actually coaching, he says that when we are teaching coaching, teaching some steps and some structures to a coaching conversation may be very useful at the beginning, because then as a coach, we can kind of have an idea, what is it that we're doing here? Later on, and as the coach develops, it's really more important to focus on the coachee and avoid becoming, as Echeverria says, rigid and losing fluidity. He states that more important than following certain steps of the process is to preserve and strengthen the emotional bond with the coachee. He says that he believes it's essential that the coach doesn't deploy a sort of scripted process, but that there is spontaneous flow that arises in the coaching conversation. The value of the interaction can only be ascertained by the coach. And I love this quote where he says that the only person who can answer whether this was a good coaching is the coachee. I quote, "It is completely absurd that the coach can be sad with their performance if the coachee is not." I would completely subscribe to that. And another quote that is really great in my view is, "In ontological coaching, there is no pre-established path. The path is made by walking, and each path is new." There is also a little segment on errors in coaching, and I would concur with Echeverria on the fact that it is absolutely impossible not to commit errors in a coaching as a coach. And the most important thing is not to not commit errors. Sorry for the not. So there will be errors. And what is important is to be able to repair them and take responsibility for what happened, and for the coaches to take responsibilities for when the relationship breaks down or when there is a glitch in the coaching relationship, rather than blaming it on the client and their resistance or something else. All in all, I think this is a philosophically very interesting book, and I will now go on to tell you my assessment in the number of points that I will give to this book. Readability. I would say this is not a book for the beach. You do have to think. Although the book is written very clearly, it requires thinking. So for readability, I would give it a 3, 2.5 to 3 points. The other thing is that it is only available in Spanish. What you can do is try and get a translation through an AI or something. But yeah, readability, 2.5 to 3 points. Academic rigor, I would say 5 points. The only thing that is lacking a little bit is quotation, but that would have probably destroyed the text. So I would say the logical argument is stringent, it is clear, and it references correctly different philosophical schools. It clearly states where Echeverria is coming from, and it clearly describes the philosophical stance of ontological coaching, which is much more than a lot of other coaching books provide. Practical usefulness, I would say maybe 2 points, because this is a philosophical book. The book is about the philosophical stance of ontological coaching. It is not about what you do as an ontological coach. However, it is not entirely unpractical, because if you adopt the philosophical stance that Echeverria, certain actions will follow. However, you do have to think about these actions yourself or read a more practical book on that practice. My final thoughts are, I want to give a big recommendation for this book for anybody who's interested in philosophy, and for anybody who's interested in more who we are as coaches rather than what is it that we do and what is it that we have to do. It's a very interesting read. I certainly enjoyed it. I was surprised about the many parallels to solution-focused and narrative coaching, and also to collaborative coaching. And I hope that I will be able to speak to Mr. Echeverria and explore the newfound cousin. So thank you very much for listening, and yeah, hope to see you and not see you soon.